So I'm going to speak about I'm going to speak about censorship in political and journalistic terms, which is the field I come from, and I'm going to relate. And my basic claim is that censorship is it's not a new claim. Censorship is not a tool that is meant to withhold information, to make something, to make the public debate more empty of information, but it's a creative tool that helps create narratives. And we're going to try and demonstrate it through two cases from recent years, from Israeli political and geopolitical debate. One of them is the attack on the Mavi Marmara, which was also referred to here in the exhibition, and the other one is the opacity policy surrounding the Israeli nuclear program. First, a note on terms. We should distinguish, we throw the word censorship very loosely around in the debate, especially on the political margins and on the fringe. And I think we should be precise. We should first make a distinction between censorship as the institution. In Israel, the full name is the military censor, which is a formal institution which operates under specific guidelines and laws, and the idea of censorship, the action, the removal or the blocking of information from public debate or from any other institution. The third element, which is way more complicated, is the even more popular notion of self-censorship, which I might get to and might not. We'll see on the time. The second remark before we begin that I should make is that the conversation on censorship is a censored conversation. Because the first thing you know if you operate with the censorship is that the first piece of information that needs to be left out is the action of censorship. Meaning that if you submit your piece to the military censor, or if you receive a gag order from the courts, which is a whole different procedure from a different institution, the gag order would say that the existence of the gag order is not to be published as well. And the military censor will also not allow you, when he or she, in our case, deletes parts of the piece, the act or the missing pieces, you're not allowed to leave blanks. You should give your readers, a full coherent narrative and not show them the blanks or even advise them that an act of censorship was performed on this piece, which leads to to many notions. Anyone interprets the pieces the way he or she wants. You could hear people on the street saying that information is being provided too freely to the public, while you can hear other people ranting that Israel is a military state and you cannot publish. And it's impossible, and that's the most significant thing, it's impossible to distinguish between a piece which was censored and a piece which wasn't censored. Even the absence of a piece which was completely removed, and those are very rare cases when a whole piece is not allowed for publication, even this act is something you wouldn't know of, but in very extreme cases. And this is very important for when we discuss the creation of new narrative, because narrative, in order to be effective, and this is not new as well, should be uninterrupted or had some sort of a flow to it. And if the reader become too conscious of the story that's being told, of the narrative, then the act of the storytelling is not as effective as it should be, especially in politics. So I like to give two examples which I think were very successful on behalf of Israel, although, again, the public perception sees them most of the time as unsuccessful. I want to demonstrate. So we'll start with the Mavi Marmara, the incidents of the military raid on a flotilla that was headed to the shores of Gaza in 2010. But the story of the Mavi Marmara should begin actually in the Second Lebanon War, where it was perceived as failure by the military and the public. But the military had a different understanding of the failure. Part of the failure, and if you read interviews with former army spokesperson Avi Bnayahu, who's a key figure in the new function of the censorship and of the spokesman act in Israel. So Avi Mnayahu refers to that part of the problem in the Second Lebanon War was that the army and the politicians lost grip of the narrative. The narrative was out of their control. The narrative of failure took over as the war prolonged, with Israelis suddenly, if you remember, trusting more the El Manar broadcast of Hassan Nasrallah's speeches than they trusted their own leadership, looking for bits of information outside. But not only that, but also compiling them into their own narrative of what happened. Like everyone, as the army now runs, everyone in the street had an opinion as people were fighting about the way the war is being performed. So the problem, the censorship problem in the eyes of the military, the censorship problem in Second Lebanon War was not what we think that people, that the press printed, that this division is going from the south and this division is going north, or that this missile hit there or there. The problem was a problem of narrative. And this led to a very aggressive policy of censorship and recreation of narrative by the army, which is still the main political institution in Israeli society ever since the Second Lebanon War, in the first and the Second Gaza War, but also very clearly in the Mavi Marmara incident. Before the IDF planned the raid, and there's actually a reference to that on the exhibition, there was a lot of thinking given to the issue of image, of control of media, of censorship, even legal thinking in the sense of what kind of messages can we block and what kind of transmission should we allow from the ship. And the first thing the IDF did was to enact, I'm not sure of the English term, but a blockade of information, meaning that it prevented any signals coming out from the ships. And when the raid started, before dawn, and from that moment on, there's a concentrated effort by the army to create a space, like an empty space out of which the new narrative could emerge. How did that happen? First, there was a blockade of all transmission from the ships. What we saw in the morning news was just a few of the first shots that were able to be transmitted just as the soldiers were boarding the ship. But more importantly, all the media that was created on the ship was confiscated as the people were arrested. And that happened really, really fast, meaning that it was planned in advance. And we have testimonies of activists that were on the ship that are being strip searched and very effectively for media that either stills or videos which they took on the ship. Meaning that in the hours after the raid, when it was clear that something went wrong on the raid, we had no visual information. We only had a few oral testimonies, some of them from the people surrounding the ship, but since most of them were in custody, then most of the oral testimonies were from politicians and the IDF itself, and we had no images. Now, days pass, and the story of the Mavi Marmara becomes a big incident. 10 people died on the ship. Actually, 9 died, and the 10th person died a year ago. He was in coma since the attack, and he died in hospital. So 10 people died on the ship, and the attack happened outside the Israeli territorial water, if you want, ex-territoria, both in the term of the image and in the term of the space. And there is an international controversy of first what to interrupt, what to understand from the event, who's to blame for the event, but even more so on what exactly happened there. Now, if you ask people what happened there, most people don't know, and they still don't know. And that was not for the lack of information. It was because information was withheld from the public. After the first day, the IDF started releasing information. And this is where the end of the censorship, the act of the censorship becomes an act of reconstructing the narrative. Out of the many, many, many hours and still photographs that were captured on the ship, and the Marmara itself had hundreds of people on it, and if you know the activist circles, everyone is documentarist in the activist circles. Like, if people are not with a camera, they'll still, use their cell phones or whatever to document every event. So there were hours and hours of documentation produced on this ship. But the army released very, very short clips. In total, over a period of several months, only 20 of them were released. And those clips had all sorts of special effects into them. The action was slowed in order to highlight a specific detail. Sometimes there were subtitles added to them. There was things were circled or an arrow showing the viewer what to see. Maybe we should watch one of those clips. The most famous one. How do I quote it? Yeah. Yeah. So that's maybe the most famous film that is still screened whenever there's a reference to the Mavi Marmara. So you can see this is the attack on the soldiers that go from the road, but you can also see that soon the clip will show all sorts of writing and effects and all that. And the entire clip is 1 minute and 2 seconds. And that was screened again and again and again in Israeli television, along with a few more of these clips, creating an image where, as you could see in this clip, helpless soldiers were attacked by a mob. Now, I don't say that this image is wrong, but many other things happened simultaneously on the ship and around it. For example, we know now that the ship was surrounded with other army ships that were trying to board it, and at a certain stage there were claims by activists that there were shots fired from boats around the ship and from the helicopters on the people on the ship itself. The second thing we know, which is not in this clip, that 3 soldiers were taken captive during the raid, held inside the ship, and later there was an IDF attempt to rescue them. We also know that 10 people died. We don't see that in any of the clips that the army released. There are claims by the medics who examined them in Turkey that some of the shots were execution-style shots from close range to the head. The army claimed that it only used 70 live bullets in the raid itself, but the number of the casualty, only on the people themselves, there were like 30 shots on the bodies, and there were also dozens of injured people. So the numbers don't really add up. But we don't see this action, and that's something very important. Now, there's also an element of the feel that you get from those far distance night vision camera. The only shift, the only disruption in this narrative created by the army happened several weeks later, or days or weeks, I don't remember exactly, when it turned out that one of the documentarists on the ship was able to smuggle a full media card, and she posted it on the internet. And when you look at the films there, unfortunately she wasn't. Wait a second. She wasn't on the top deck where the actual battle took place. But when you look at this hour-long image, at this hour-long clip, it looks very, very different from the kind of feel that you get from the clips the army released. It's available on YouTube, but the action starts somewhere here. You can see the army boats here trying to board. You can hear shots all the time in the background. Here are the commando vessels around. You can see the people walking around. You can see later on the wounded are being treated. Okay, where's the wounded part?
Some of this for give me down here. No, give me down here. Give me down.
Of course, there's a very humanizing effect to this long clip because you see the action from the point of view of the people in the ship, which are unarmed and surrounded by the region's strongest military. Imagine what would have been the perception if we had all the images that were held that were taken from the Mavi Marmara. There were also small side stories of political manipulations in the way the clips were released to the Israeli public. For example, if you remember the clip of Hanin Zuabi arguing with the soldiers, this made some headways in the Israeli media. It was released on the morning that Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi was to testify before the Turkey committee that investigated. So the public attention shifted immediately from the Chief of Staff giving an appearance on the committee that investigated the event to Hanin Zuabi and confronting IDF soldiers and all that comes with it. So that's the Mavi Marmara. Do I have a few more minutes to reach the opacity issue? That's the Mavi Marmara, and I think the Mavi Marmara, again, I'll going back to the exhibition and to the quotes that Uti and Mayan bring from a Knesset hearing. It's on the left side of the wall on the second floor. There are quotes from a Knesset hearing on the issue, on the raid, and they all deal with the sort of propaganda failure of the first day. Why the army didn't release more material in the first day to take control of the narrative. But I think the army was way smarter than the politicians on that. The army created this space on the first day where it could re-engage with the public with a new narrative, a narrative that serves it better. And you can see in hindsight that except for the relations with Turkey, which were completely broken, not the political level, nor the army, the heads of the army, nor Israel as a whole paid a price for an incident which on face value raises a lot of questions. International water, unarmed activist, the fact that the army was forced to use so much violence and so on. Now I want to look at the different, we can turn on the light, there are no more clips. I want to look at another field of censorship in Israel, which is the censorship around the nuclear weapon. And I think this is the most important, if people are asking what aspect of political life is totally censored, then the immediate answer is always the nuclear weapon. The military censor, the courts, they're very, very aggressive when it comes to upholding the censorship on issue of nuclear weapons. I will tell a tiny funny incident how the absurdity of it gets. I think 10 years ago, Tom Segev released the book 1967, a research on the war and the moves that are leading to it, and he submitted the book to the military censor, and the military censor removed various sections that had to do with the nuclear issue. But a day or two before the launch of the book at the Books Week in the spring, which is the biggest time to release books in Israel, it was discovered that the military censor left out a single sentence which was supposed to be removed. The sentence it refers to the nomination of Moshe Dayan as Minister of Defense in the Eshkol government just before the war, and it says that Dayan, while becoming the government, because it feared Dayan, removed some of Dayan's power before nominating him. Among them was the power to declare war and the power to... Now, the military censor saw that something wrong was written in this sentence, but Keter Publishing says to the military censor, we already submitted the book, you deleted what you needed to delete. And the military censor is threatening, and the books are printed and ready to be sold. The military censor threatening not to allow selling the book. So the solution that was found was that all the employees of Keter stayed up all night before the book launch, and they used Tipex to erase this sentence. So if you have the first edition copy, like I do in my house, and you hold the page in front of the light, you can see that Moshe Dayan was not allowed to authorize the use of nuclear weapons or unconventional weapons on his own. So this is an absurd moment because the military censor obviously knows that some people in Israel know how to handle a piece of Tipex. And that goes against what I said at the beginning. This is a place where the act of censoring needed to be seen. In the nuclear issue, because of the weirdness of the policy of opacity, amimut, it's better to have censorship which is viewed by the public than to have nothing at all, either no information and or free information. And to understand that, we need to understand nuclear weapons. The irony of nuclear weapons is that secret nuclear weapons are useless because there's an understanding that countries are not going to use nuclear weapons in wars, or there's no legitimacy for such use. Nuclear weapons serve as a weapon of deterrence. It means to prevent other nations from doing something to you, because they know you have nuclear weapon. But if they don't know you have nuclear weapon, then the whole point becomes useless. So we need to know about nuclear weapons. When Israel created the nuclear program in the 50s and the 60s, it was in the context of the Cold War. And Israel's allies, meaning the French and later on the Americans, could not afford allowing client states introduce nuclear weapons into one of the most explosive areas during the Cold War. So the solution that was found was allowing Israel to go on with the nuclear program, but allowing also a space of deniability to all parties involved. And the form that this policy took is the form of opacity, meaning everybody knows Israel has nuclear weapons, nobody is allowed to speak about them. Example, to what degree we're not allowed? If I write on this paper, I know that Israel has 80 nuclear warheads, and I put the paper in my pocket, I could be arrested for unlawfully holding secret information. But if I write, according to a publication in The Guardian, Israel has 80 nuclear warheads, the censorship will not do that because the censorship knows that it cannot prevent the flow of information from outside. And it even benefits from the flow of information from outside. Meaning the fact that the Sunday Times or The Guardian are writing about the nukes serves Israel in the sense of deterrence, but we cannot discuss it because it hurts the policy of opacity. The opacity is being upheld so aggressively that the few people that dare to challenge it suffered enormous repercussions. We all know the case of Mordechai Vanunu, one of the only Israelis who served his entire sentence and was punished again after his release. And he's still under condition like he was released on parole, where he served his entire sentence. But there are also other affairs, like the retired general, the Yatza affair, retired general who found himself in a prison for a full year at the age of 70 for thinking about writing a memoir in which he relates to some aspect of the nuclear issue, or the person who documented the policy of opacity, Professor Avner Cohen, who wrote a book about the history of opacity and couldn't go back to Israel for 10 years because he was under the threat of arrest. So the repercussions are enormous. But the result on the Israeli politics and Israeli history is also enormous. Because we constructed in our minds a history and politics which are freed of the fact that we have nuclear weapons. When we consider problems, political issue, when we learn history, we simply leave a black hole in the issue of the nuclear weapons, or we don't even put it as part of the story. Example, the 6-Day War. There's a school of thought outside Israel in history that the 6-Day War should be seen in the context of the nuclear arm race, meaning that the Russians allowed a more free hand to the Egyptians and the Syrians because they knew Israel is becoming a nuclear threshold state. Meaning that what we thought was an issue of borders with Egypt might have been a part of the nuclear race of the Cold War. There's a famous book by Simon Hirsch, I don't remember the name, but I think it's Fox is Bats over Dimona or something, and the names come from a famous Soviet mission above Dimona in the 60s, an aerial photography mission. We, of course, as Israelis, we don't think in those terms because we don't think about the nuclear issue. Again, Iran learned from the best, so they engage in a policy of opacity as well when developing their nuclear program. They actually go step by step by the Israeli manual. But we never think about the Iranian problem as part of the nuclear race in the Middle East. In fact, the Israeli Prime Minister goes abroad and says, we need to prevent a nuclear race in the Middle East. But the nuclear race exists in the Middle East because the biggest superpowers in the Middle East are engaged in a nuclear race already. So our political judgment and our political understanding is considerably diminished. And it goes all the way to the fact that we don't understand how few countries hold nuclear weapons and what effect they have on their environment and many other issues. You know, Israel is part of a small club, I think 10 countries that hold nuclear weapons. And we're not a tiny member because the only two countries that hold like thousands of warheads are Russia and the United States. Israel's a figure of between 80 and 400 according to foreign sources. It's actually very close to the Chinese that hold 200 warheads, and it's more than India and Pakistan and North Korea. We don't understand issues of our nuclear trade. Now we know that Israel sold nuclear knowledge and plans to apartheid South Africa. But at the time, did we know that? Of course not. And we don't know environmental issue. Of course, Channel 2 had to petition to the Supreme Court to publish the fact that the government was distributing anti-radiation pills in Dimona. So all these issues are outside our knowledge, yet we feel that we have a complete picture of the geopolitical actions of our government. We don't see the black hole. We created a new narrative. I think I'll stop here, and maybe in the panel we'll go back to all the various actions of censorship which I wanted to discuss. Thank you.